Hello, this video is a condensed version of a webinar given to 4th semester PG students of English Language and Literature in Kerala University. So, this introduction to research methodology in literary studies is basically meant for PG students. There is nothing really new in this video, but it should hopefully provide a little bit more clarity into the research process. There is usually a bit of confusion and tension when one is about to embark on a research project, and our state of mind at this juncture could resemble the now picture. However, a better awareness of the research process should ease the agony a little, and we will definitely at some point of time reach the later happy stage when we have the completed work in our hand. Obviously, the journey will be challenging. Observe the lack of hair, but it should definitely be worth the effort. This session tries to answer some basic questions. What is the purpose of doing research? Are there any skills, knowledge, abilities, or attitudes needed to be able to do research? What is research? Is there a methodology for doing literary research? And what is the process involved in research? Now, why do we have to do research at the PG level? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It's because it's part of our curriculum. Given half a chance, we would not have anything to do with it. But understanding the research process is important because it is a crucial skill we will need in our adult lives, both professional and personal. And that is why it has been included in the UG and PG curriculum. The curriculum and the teaching learning process at any level has to be rigorous, challenging, future-oriented, and appropriate for that level. And it must become more rigorous and challenging as we move up. At the end of every level, we are expected to come out with certain learned behaviors, a certain level of knowledge, skills, and values, which will give us the confidence to face the next stage in our life. Knowledge, skills, and attitudes or values actually parallel Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of learning, where he talks about cognitive, psychomotor, and affective skills. Now, what is the knowledge, skills, and values we are expected to have when we complete 3 + 2 years of UG and PG programs? Obviously, we should have the knowledge and the skills to go for a research degree anywhere in India or the world. We should also have the knowledge and skills to take up a job after our PG degree. Very importantly, if this is teaching, we should definitely have the knowledge, skills, and values to teach either at the school or college level. We will need to have exceptional communication skills in English and the ability to think critically and creatively, and to be able to organize and structure our thoughts persuasively and with clarity using the English language skills we have developed. If we go for a job, we should have good team skills to survive and do well in challenging work environments. As for values or attitudes, we should have developed a lifelong commitment to learning, especially if we plan to become teachers, and the motivation to be an effective autonomous learner. We need to have developed mature value systems whereby we behave as adults with self-knowledge, who are capable of being respectful to everybody around us, and who are kind, generous, helpful, and forgiving by nature. What is perhaps important to notice, but is usually not real understood, is that almost all of these skills or knowledge and attitudes can be developed to some extent through research. The main reason for our apprehension about doing research at the PG level could be that we are doing research seriously for the first time, or because we do not have an adequate awareness of the process of research. But are there certain skills and abilities and attributes which could help us to do literary research? If there are, what are they? Let's take a look at some prerequisite skills which we might need for research. These are not new skills, and we are not unaware that these skills are needed. First of all, we need to have a commitment to academics and learning as a PG student. This means that we are methodical and systematic in our approach, that we are self-disciplined and committed to hard work, and that we have an abiding interest in the discipline, which gives us happiness to engage with texts of different kinds. Closely allied with this is a good reading habit. This not only means reading around 2 to 4 novels a month, but also reading during our PG program as many of the texts by the prescribed authors in the syllabus. For example, if we enjoyed any of Donne's poems, it should be a natural progression to his other poems or letters. We should also be independent and creative and analytical thinkers. Our mind should always be reacting to whatever our senses take in very thoughtful and creative ways. Now, this is where a basic understanding of literary theory plays its role. Literary theory offers us different perspectives to analyze what we see around us, especially when we figure out how power plays out in our lives and in the world. And of course, to think deeply and to put down our thoughts with clarity, we would need very good language skills in English, especially reading and writing, as far as research is concerned. Ultimately, hard work is all it takes. But one would get a head start if these skills came naturally to us by the time we started serious research. Before we get into research, a certain amount of background reading is presumed. This is just very basic background reading needed for doing research at the PG level. We would need a couple of good books on the history of English literature, a few on literary terms, and a couple on literary theory and thesis writing. The expectation is that we should be reasonably familiar with all these books. They should be well thumbed through books, especially because all of them are books for the undergraduate level. All these books will play a crucial role in helping us to plan our PG dissertation. In the next few slides, let's take a quick check regarding where we stand regarding the prerequisite skills mentioned earlier. A sharp skill in close reading is essential at the PG level and for research, as we have to respond intensely to the text we are reading. If we have the skill, have a good reading habit, a solid commitment to academics, and are reasonably familiar with the books mentioned previously, we should be able to answer the following questions. These questions are based on the couple of lines taken from a very famous poem. So the questions to which we should have answers to are given here. From which poem are these lines taken and who wrote this poem? Which is the key figurative device in these lines and what do you call it? If you can analyze this figurative device in terms of tenor and vehicle, which is the tenor and which is the vehicle? Would you consider this a figurative device where, quote, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, unquote? And if so, how would you classify this device? In which essay does the poet reveal that he has a particular fondness for the metaphysical poets? Which is the verb used metaphorically in these lines? What kind of a metaphor is it? What is the tenor and the vehicle? There is a sharp contrast between the tone and the title of the poem and the opening line, and the line with the figurative device. How would you describe this tone? How would you explain the tone within the figurative device in terms of the idea of modernism? We should be able to formulate some kind of answer regarding these questions. This is another quick check to see how closely and intensely we negotiate with a literary text. You can ignore the picture. It's not very relevant here. It's just used to make the slide colorful. The poem is a famous imagistic poem by Ezra Pound titled In a Station of the Metro. If our reading habit is good, we should be able to place the location as an underground metro, which in fact Pound could have used while he was in England at the time of composing this couplet. Now what we have to think about is what could be the answers to the following questions which come in the next slide. Obviously, the speaker is standing in the underground station and it is crowded. All right, just read these two lines carefully and let's just see if we can answer the following questions. Okay, is it a quickly moving crowd? How do we know that? Which is the key linguistic element responsible for this interpretation? Do certain faces in this quickly moving crowd grab the speaker's attention? And does the speaker lose sight of them and try to spot them again? Were these faces etched in the speaker's mind, at least for a short while? How do we know this? What is the figurative device used in the second line? Can it be analyzed in terms of tenor and vehicle? Where is the speaker standing and where is the crowd? If we are not told that the poet is bound, is there anything suggesting that the speaker is a male? What are the phases of these special people in the crowd compared to? Is there any feminine connotation for this vehicle? If so, could the speaker be a male who is subtly showing his appreciation for feminine beauty? From a feminist perspective, is there anything which reveals a patriarchal bias or tendency in these lines? What do you think is the tone of the poem? The next 3 slides could check how creatively and critically we react to images we constantly see in our culture. This is an ad by Axe with the tagline, "Part good, part bad, that's man's essence." Let's see how we react to this particular image. What is the good and what is the bad here? What does the image say? What does it speak about? What does it reveal about conventional notions of male sexuality? And does it contrast notions of masculinity and femininity? If so, how? Let's take a close look at these 3 images. This celebrity couple needs no introduction. But is there anything which catches our attention when we look at these 3 pictures? Or to look at it slightly differently so that we also get a clue, why does the woman have a tendency to bend her head to one side? What cultural or patriarchal norm does she subscribe to when she does this, perhaps unconsciously? How does power play out in these pictures? This is the last slide in this sequence. Let's look at these 2 pictures. Do these 2 pictures tell us anything about our culture? They are both classrooms, but is there any suggestion that different disciplines are being taught in these 2 classrooms? If yes, why? And what could be the reasons for this gender bias? Hopefully these slides would have helped to demonstrate how our prerequisite skills kick in when we react to texts we constantly see around us. Okay, let's now come to the question, what is research? Obviously, we do have some idea of what it involves, but let us try to get a bit more specific. So what is research? What we tend to forget is that research is not something we do only for a term paper or project. Actually, we do research all the time, and sometimes the research we do is really intense. One good example of a really intense bit of research most of us have done happened when we bought a new phone. The intensity of that research often beats the intensity of writing a research paper. But that was truly genuine research because it almost naturally followed the research process. So what is research? This is one definition. Let's just look at it carefully. Now let's think. Couldn't this be a good description of what went into researching the new phone? Now that we have a very general understanding of what research is, let us move towards the methodology of research. So what is methodology? Essentially, it is a structured, logical process followed to solve a research problem. Now, every discipline could have its own research process, its own unique methods, rules, and principles. So methodology refers to the underlying concepts and theories which are responsible for the methods adopted in a specific discipline, which includes the methods adopted to collect data. So, does literary studies or English studies have a methodology specific to itself? If we take the history of literary studies, we could observe the following movement in methodology. The 3 figures indicate how the literary text T has been studied down the ages. The first figure shows how the text was studied from around approximately the middle of the 19th century to around 1940. The literary text was studied from three perspectives: from the perspective of the author, from the perspective of the socio-historical milieu of the world, and that of the reader or the audience are. The literary text was seen as providing evidence for historical data and was read within the matrix of the socio-historical context. For example, a classic text like Dowden's Shakespeare, a critical study of his mind and art, first published in 1875, argues that there is a connection between the evolution of his mind and his art. In this kind of reading, there was a lot of extraneous information, and interpretation tended to be subjective and discursive. 1940 signaled the arrival of formalistic new criticism with its focus exclusively on the text, disregarding everything outside the text as extraneous irrelevant information. This move coincided with the empiricism, humanism, and the scientific rigor associated with this period, with the focus on the words on the page and on reading the poem as a poem and nothing else. However, with the move to theory and the breaking down of the grand narratives of humanism, literary studies understood that the world could not be separated from the text, and saw meaning as a continuous dialectic or a to and fro between the text and its world. Now, these are not smooth, seamless movements from one into the other, and the methodology of modern literary studies draws from all these movements, especially in the importance given to the practice of close reading since 1940. So we could see modern methodology as being affiliated to different perspectives for analysis. One could roughly divide them into the formalistic, the philosophical, and the one drawing out the power play within the text and its world. The research student needs to be aware of these frameworks because academic sophistication usually comes from drawing upon the insights of these perspectives. The interesting thing is that any and all of these perspectives can be applied to any literary text. It is how one perceives the problem that determines the perspective. Moreover, it is also possible to have multiple perspectives guiding the hermeneutic or the interpretative process. Now let's take a look at this character from a very popular Malayalam movie, which unfortunately used the effeminate male as a punching bag, and one can read reams of patriarchal bias into just this image. For example, the formalistic new critic would say that the character is revealed in the form, in the sindoor, in the bead necklace, the long curly hair, the tilt of the wrist, if one were to take only this image. The structuralist would say meaning resides in the structural opposite, a bead necklace versus the non-bead necklace, or the sindoor versus the non-sindoor. The humanist would say the character has to overcome moral agony, while the modernist would say the character is fragmented and alienated because of his existential angst. The post-structuralist could argue that this is a perfect demonstration of the fluidity of gender. The character is both and neither, male and female at the same time, a classic case of aporia. The deconstructionist would argue that the bead necklace is the key to unraveling the knot of fixed meaning because it contains the traces of all the different kinds of necklaces. And gender critics would decry the inhuman, insensitive portrayal of such characters by people who do not understand gender roles, and so on and so forth. So now let's try to get a bit more specific about the research. To adapt this quote by the famous American tennis star Arthur Ashe, what is important in research is the process. The end product, the dissertation, will take care of itself if we follow the process. And much of the satisfaction one may draw from research work has to do with the process when one gets the process right. It's like asking our students, which is more important, focusing on getting a rank or getting to a stage where we enjoy our studies. The enjoyment lies in the process. A rank is just a byproduct. This is one representation of the research process, where the progression is nearly chronological, though there could be overlapping of time frames in the process. One starts off with identifying the topic area, which is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of research, and then goes on to narrowing the focus of the study by raising the research question or stating the research problem. The hypothetical answer to the research question would be the hypothesis, which will lead to framing the objectives, which actually flows from the hypothesis. Once this is done, one would start preparing a working bibliography, though there would already be secondary materials ready to go into this list from the initial reading done while identifying the topic. This is followed by the task of collecting material listed in the working bibliography and preparing the chapter outline. Note making could start after this, from where one progresses to writing the first draft of the project. We will go into deeper detail into these steps while remembering that this is a flexible framework, though the elements within it are fairly constant. Now let's just check whether we followed this process when we did that intense researching while picking out that new phone for ourselves. The equivalent to selecting a topic would be buying a new phone. The research question would be, how can I select a phone which is appropriate for me? Or as a statement, it is difficult to buy a new phone. What are the steps one can take to do this? Your hypothesis would be something like, it is possible to arrive at a selection if you choose the criteria for selection carefully. Your objectives would flow from the hypothesis. They could be something like, what are the criteria I'm looking for in my new phone? How can I prioritize my criteria to help my selection? How can I narrow my search down to these 3 phones? I have a reasonable idea of where I can get information from. They will be online sources like GSM Arena or NDTV Gadgets or YouTube. It could even be a friend of mine. This is my working bibliography. Once I have my sources, I will retrieve pages which have information relevant for me and store them somewhere. Now I am ready to prepare my outline, which will be actually the prioritized list of criteria. The next step would be to start making notes or tabulating the comparisons. After I am done with this, I'm ready to make my first draft, which is to narrow my selection to 3 phones. And my final draft of my thesis here will be the selection of 1 phone out of these 3. Research is research, whether it is buying a phone or writing a 200-page dissertation. Let's go into slightly greater detail into these steps. The first step, selecting a topic, is often the most challenging step. If we have a sound reading habit or a passionate interest, these would be immensely helpful because we can choose an area we are familiar with and like. This is because the best option would always be to do research on an area or topic we really like. So we could start off our selection with a genre or a subject which we are really interested in. Do we want to work on poetry or fiction? Or is it going to be children's literature or phonetics? Or slasher movies? Or Malayalam soaps? Or fashion? After this, we have to engage seriously with quite a bit of texts in our area of interest so that we are able to identify our primary text. This will take some time because we will also have to formulate a tentative research problem during this time. We would also need to look into basic secondary sources in order to narrow the topic down and arrive at a statement of the problem. For example, if we consider doing a PhD, one should take at least 6 months of dedicated reading and researching to select the topic. For a PG dissertation, we would get around 3 weeks if we start at the beginning of the semester itself. And this topic should be relevant and offer some new insight. We would also need a topic for which there are adequate secondary sources. If the texts are very recent and there is a positive secondary sources, one would have to create secondary sources. For example, by interviewing people who can talk authoritatively about our texts. Once we have identified our topic area and read our primary and secondary texts with diligence, our next step would be to formulate the research problem. During our reading, we should be able to latch on to something we see as a significant idea or reading. On the basis of our secondary reading, we might realize that there is a gap in knowledge about this particular interpretative perspective we have reached. Thus, during this time, we are narrowing the focus of the study to isolate the problem in order to try and resolve it through our analysis. This research problem thus identified is usually stated in the first paragraph of the first introductory chapter of our dissertation. The first paragraph of the introduction would therefore be a summary of the entire introductory chapter and end with the statement of the problem. We now arrive at another critical step in the research process, formulating the hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? Our intense but limited reading of primary and secondary sources has helped us identify the research problem. We should now try to write a single sentence hypothesis, which is a statement of our intuitive awareness of what our argument for the project is going to be. So, a hypothesis is a proposed explanation based on limited evidence, which will be the starting point of our study. Now, different disciplines adopt different modes of stating the hypothesis. It might be best to frame it in a single sentence in English studies. If the hypothesis is written with clarity, it will actually guide the research process from now on. Our objectives will follow naturally from the hypothesis, the chapter outlines will evolve from it, and identifying secondary sources and collecting material will also be guided by this statement. Let's take a simple example of a hypothesis. Let us assume we have identified the following research problem. Uncle Tom's Cabin seems to have had an influence on the formulation of laws during the Civil War. Now, the hypothesis would be a reformulation of the research question and a statement of our main argument of the project. Thus, the hypothesis here is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin influenced changes in the law of slavery in pre- and post-Civil War America. The title also follows from the hypothesis, as could the objectives. Let us see how objectives flow from this hypothesis. Wouldn't the following objectives of the study follow inevitably from just the hypothesis? 1. What were the laws relating to slavery in pre- and post-Civil War America? 2. Were changes made to these laws during this time? If so, what were they? 3. What are the significant events in Uncle Tom's Cabin? 4. How did the plight of the slaves as presented in the novel result in changes to the laws of slavery, etc.? Thus, once we formulate the hypothesis, we can see that the rest of the thesis actually flows naturally from the hypothesis. As we just discussed, the next step in the research process, that is, stating the objectives of the study, thus follows naturally from the hypothesis. Now, the objectives could be written as questions, as we just did, or it could be written as statements, something like the objectives of this study therefore are 2, 1, 2, 3, etc. It is usual to have around 3 to 5 objectives in a research project at the PG level. Another interesting point to note is that the statement of the problem we made at the beginning of the introductory chapter could actually be a statement of the general objective. We have even been advised in the syllabus to frame it as a sentence beginning, quote, therefore the aim of this project is to, unquote. So the specific objectives we frame here would be an expansion of this general objective. The objectives could also decide how the chapters are outlined and how the content is organized. We will go into that soon. Now, what is a working bibliography? It is a constantly evolving list of all the secondary sources we will be identifying, collecting, and reading to buttress our argument. Even before we frame the hypothesis and the objectives, we could have books which could go into this bibliography. These are the secondary sources we referred to while we were in the process of identifying our research problem. We usually get texts which will go into the working bibliography from the bibliographies of significant secondary sources we identify. Now, this list could expand when we find what seems like significant secondary sources, or could contract when we realize that a book we added in this list is not very important for our argument and we put it aside. It is very important and useful to write our working bibliography in the MLA format, because our working bibliography will finally morph into the works cited page, which is a list of the books in the working bibliography which we have cited in our writing. It is expected that the final works cited list should have around 10 to 25 entries at the PG level, which means that our working bibliography will be much longer than this. Collecting material refers to the act of getting physical or soft copies of secondary materials we will be reading. This often happens as and when we add books into the working bibliography. Once we identify a book for the working bibliography, we would try to locate it. This would be followed by skimming the contents of the book, especially the contents page and the index page at the end of the book, to determine whether we need to get a hard or soft copy of the whole book or a part of the book. It is always advisable to get hard copies of the significant secondary sources we will always be consulting during the research process, and ideally of all the texts we will be quoting in our dissertation, that is, the books in our works cited lists. The texts we might only refer to in the dissertation and not summarize or quote could be collected as soft copies and stored as online bookmarks. However, it is always advisable to download a hard copy of all online resources we plan to quote or cite along with this URL. It is unbelievably easy to see an online page you had identified as important disappear into the black hole of the internet if we did not download a hard copy along with its URL. How we arrange this collected material will depend on the outline of each of the chapters. By this time in our research, we would have a fairly good idea of our chapter divisions. What needs to be done now is to prepare a bullet points outline for each chapter. As we mentioned earlier, the chapter division could follow from the objectives. If our objectives have been framed logically and sequentially, the answer to each of our objectives could constitute each of the core chapters. That is why it is practical to frame 3 objectives so that we could have 3 core chapters. Even if there are more than 3 objectives, our chapter division could roughly parallel these objectives. Now, within each chapter, we would have to formulate the subpoints and further subpoints. We should be able to do this if our hypothesis and objectives are well formulated and we have a good idea of the content of our primary and secondary sources. This will also help us to arrange our collected secondary material. We could label our secondary material on the basis of the outline points because we know that we would be summarizing or quoting from a particular text when we argue a point in a particular bullet point within a chapter. Outlining the chapters is crucial in getting our writing solidly organized with one idea leading to the next. It it is also very advisable to reframe the outline points as the subtitles within each chapter. This will make it very easy for our examiner to follow the logic of our argument. We now start making notes. The notes will be our analysis of the primary and secondary texts. When we write notes, it is important to distinguish among three kinds of notes, as the MLA handbook points out. Direct quotes from the text, which we will be presenting as direct quotes in our thesis, summaries from secondary sources, and our own writing or interpretation of what we read. Most of our thesis would comprise our writing with quotes and summaries to substantiate the argument of what we wrote. Now, we would have to devise our own method of making notes. It could be handwritten in a notebook or even loose leaves of paper, or it could be entered into a Word file or into OneNote in MS Office. But one important and practical thing we could do is to always have note cards with us. This is because when we are seriously into research, into thinking and writing, we do not know when we can get a striking idea or interpretation which we will need to note down immediately. When we write notes, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. We would be making notes for each of our bullet points in our outline. Therefore, each page of our notes should have a title, which would be one of the bullet points in our outline. And there should only be one main idea on one page of our notes. And as mentioned earlier, we should be able to differentiate on each page we write between a direct quote, a summary, and our own writing. If and when we note down a direct quote or summary, we should also have a reference to the page number and title of the text we are quoting or summarizing. If we write our notes systematically and well, we should be able to do our writing of the thesis exclusively on the basis of these notes without referring to our primary or secondary sources. Let's now see how we can go about writing our first draft. Our first step would be to write the introductory chapter of roughly 10 to 15 pages. This chapter could have the following sections: statement of the problem, significance of the topic, review of literature, hypothesis, objectives, methodology, delimitations and limitations, and chapter division. Delimitations refer to the boundaries and scope of our research, where we spell out what we will be doing and what is outside the scope of the project. This would be followed by the limitations of the project, essentially because of the delimitations. The first chapter would be written very quickly and need not be polished now. Ideally, we should not take more than 5 days or around 25 hours to write the first version of the first chapter. We then move on to the core chapters, usually 3 in number, but this can vary, with each chapter having a clear introduction and conclusion and divided into subsections with subtitles. What we need to keep in mind is that the core chapters should be around 30 pages and the introduction and the conclusion together around 20 pages for a total of 50 pages. Once we have written the conclusion, we go back and write the introduction again. This will be the second draft and the first intense writing of the introductory chapter. We rewrite the introduction because after we complete the conclusion, there is always a possibility that our original argument could have become modified in the course of our research. From here, we move to the rest of the chapters again and finally revise the introduction and conclusion once again. Now we proceed to the final print. After completing the introduction, which is the core chapters, and the conclusion, which is the base of the pyramid, we then prepare the final works cited page. After this, the next higher level, we prepare the cover pages, then the content page, and finally we collate and print. With this, our research process is done. And so is this session. This is definitely not the final word on this topic. And what we have done is only a very general introduction to research methodology in English studies. Thank you.